not quite sure. I think I'm right in saying that Elizabeth Bishop was prescribed for study in the very first iteration of this Leaving Cert that you're sitting back in 2001. I think I'm right about that. And she's been part of the course intermittently since then. She's a very popular poet, and this is one of the poems, The Prodigal by Elizabeth Bishop, which has always made an impact on students, and I hope I do it some justice in this video. This video is going to be made up of 2 parts. I'm going to break it up into 2 parts. And I don't know really what it is that really impacts upon students about this poem, other than the fact that it's it's 2 things, right? It's very clever and imaginative, and it's very personal. So I'm going to break it down, but I want you to remember that the whole poem, the imagery in the whole poem is an extended metaphor. So when she's talking about the prodigal son, which is of course a biblical allusion, a reference to the Bible, a story from the Bible, she's talking about herself. Okay? So the picture she paints of this person who has wasted his life, the story in the Bible that Jesus tells, it's a parable from the New Testament, of the prodigal son, is a story of waste. It's a story of vanity, and it's a story of somebody who makes huge mistakes in their life. Now, we'll come to what the rest of the story is about maybe in the next second half of this video. But essentially, I'm going to boil it down, and you biblical scholars can row in and correct me. But essentially, the story is, and again, the symbolism is what really matters here, of a young man whose dad was like a farmer and lived in a rural area, and who was really bored by life. So he wasn't happy with who he was. So he went to his dad. He said, "Dad, give me my, if you like, give me my share of the family's wealth. Give me my inheritance. Because I want to go off and I want to live a life. I don't want to be stuck here working on a farm my whole life." So, reluctantly his father agreed, and he gives him the money, and off he goes to the big city, and he does all the things that young people do, in the big city, committing all those sins as it would be perceived in the Bible, and gambling and drinking and chasing women and all that good stuff, and wastes all his money. Runs out of money and ends up working as a swineherd. So a swineherd, like a shepherd is somebody who minds sheep. A swineherd is somebody who minds pigs. And in the first stanza of this poem, which is a sonnet, the poem is not a sonnet, the first stanza is a sonnet, and in fact so is the second stanza. So it's a double sonnet, which is testimony to Bishop's kind of technical skill as a writer. And by the way, the poem was written in perfect iambic pentameter as well. So it has a lovely rhythm. I'm going to make a video in which I explain what a lot of these techniques mean. But iambic pentameter essentially means that there are 10 syllabic beats in each line, or in most lines. So if you look at the first 2 lines, the brown enormous odour he lived by was too close with its breathing and thick hair. So see? So that gives it a kind of a rhythmic, a flow, a cadence, a beat. It doesn't happen by accident. It's the skill of the poet. And in the first stanza, she creates this scenario, a little scene, where she imagines the prodigal, this person who's described by Christ in the Bible. She imagines him living his miserable life as a swineherd. And what's extraordinary about the first stanza, and what's really famous, and I think this is why this poem really stayed with students over the years, what's extraordinary about it is the fact that it is so vivid, because this poet is able to create incredibly powerful imagery which appeals to the senses. Let's have a quick look here. Sorry, I just want to get rid of the rest of that there because I want to be able to write things in here. Again, the reason that box is at the side of all the poems is so you can make notes, okay? And I have to make them a little bit bigger because I'm working on an iPad screen. Now, so she says, the brown, enormous odour he lived by, note the American spelling of odour, she's an American poet, was too close with its breathing and thick hair for him to judge. Now, it's a very striking and unusual opening line. You don't really understand what's going on in that opening line. It doesn't really make clear sense, but it is certainly striking. It draws us in, and it draws us in because of the unusual noun-adjective combinations. We don't normally think of a smell, odour, as having a colour, brown. We don't normally think of a smell having a size, enormous. Yet when we hear the words brown, enormous odour, we get what she's describing. Oh, for God, Jesus. We get that she's describing an overwhelming stench. The stench of pigs. We're in a pig pen. And the poet is stimulating not our visual sense in this opening line, in this opening section, but our olfactory sense. And that immediately brings us into the world of the prodigal. It makes that world vivid, and it makes the description that the poet employs immersive. So then she begins to show us and let us feel what this place is like. She says, the floor was rotten. Now that appeals to our haptic sense. So you can feel that. You can imagine walking on the floor. Oh God, it's underfoot. It's slimy and dirty and gives way. And then there's the smell. So we have the olfactory sense stimulated. We have the haptic sense. The sty was plastered halfway up with glass smooth dung. And now we have the visual sense. So if you ever want to point at a poem where, one of my former colleagues, the great Dennis Craven, used to use this term painterly, which I stole from him. If you ever want to look at a poet whose style is painterly, Bishop is a great example of that. Now, most poets are able to create vivid imagery, but this is every little detail, every little brushstroke is adding to the scene. It's making it vivid. She's using words to provoke our senses, to provoke our imagination, to bring us into this horrific setting where there's the pigs, because they're a certain height, they've rubbed themselves, they're rolling around in their own filth and feces, and they're rubbing it against the sides of the sty. The stench is overwhelming. It's brown and enormous. There is the floor that he's sitting on, the prodigal, is rotten. So this is a depiction of a person who has fallen. Imagine living in those conditions. So this person has fallen as far as it's possible to fall. And what you've got to get in your head is that Bishop is using this to describe how she feels about her own life. So don't be too literal. It doesn't mean that she feels she's living in a pig pen. But she's saying this is how she feels. This is the extent of failure. This is the extent of self-loathing that she feels when she thinks about herself. That she's like the prodigal in a stinking hole. She's made a mess of her life. That's how she feels. She goes on to describe him light-lashed. Never understood what that meant. Light-lashed. I have images of the light coming through the slats, the wood of the pen. Self-righteous, I know what that means. So even though he's fallen all the way down, he's still a bit proud and arrogant. Above moving snouts, the pig's eyes followed him. A cheerful stare. And then, for me, one of the two great lines in the opening stanza. Even to the sow that... I ruined it. Even to the sow that always ate her young. Now just listen to that line. A sow is a mother pig. Her young are her babies. There's an image here of a pig eating its own piglets. Now when you hear that, it's disturbing. It's as visceral an image visceral means deliberately designed to trouble us, as one can imagine. It's disturbing, that image. You can hear the squeals of the piglet as its mother, rips through its flesh. You can hear the crunch of the bones as the powerful jaws of the adult pig destroys the baby. It's unnatural. It's appalling. And this is the poet's way, through imagery and symbolism, of communicating her sense of where she is in her life at this moment. It is a place that she is appalled by. It's a place that disgusts her. It couldn't be worse. And of course, the crucial thing is, why is the prodigal in the story in the Bible? Why is he there? It's his own fault. It's due to his own folly, to the mistakes that he made. And the parallels are obvious then with how the poet feels about her life. She feels that she is in this hellish, awful place in her life, and it's her own fault. And this image of the prodigal having fallen so low that she even has to tickle the chin of the sow that eats her own babies with its blood, and it's disgusting. Till sickening, he leaned to scratch her head. Now, so that's in a sonnet. That's a typical Petrarchan sonnet, where we have an 8-line sequence. That's called an octave or octet. But then you have a 6-line sequence that follows it. That's really important. And this 6-line sequence is called a sestet. And it has, for me, one of the best images in all of Bishop's poetry. I'm just going to read the 6 lines for you. But sometimes, mornings after drinking bouts, he hid the pints behind the 2x4s. The sunrise glazed the barnyard mud with red. The burning puddles seemed to reassure, and he almost thought he might endure his exile yet another year or more. You'll hear me saying this a lot. I'm always like, it's difficult for me to explain how impressed I am when writers are as controlled as that. This is just brilliant writing. And what you have to get is that word exile is somebody who's miserable because they're separated from home. And one of the key thematic motifs in Bishop's life, and we'll talk about this in more detail in the video on the poem Filling Station, but one of the key thematic motifs and Sestina in Bishop's life is the fact that, as you know, because we've discussed this with the fish, when she was born, her dad died when she was only a baby, less than 6 months old. Her mum, consumed by grief and shock, had a psychological breakdown, and Bishop never lived with her mother. Her mother spent the rest of her life in an institution. She was cared for by her paternal grandparents, and then by her maternal grandparents, and then by an uncle and an aunt. And she never, ever felt that she belonged anywhere. She went to boarding school. She never, ever felt that she had a home. So that's what it feels to be exiled, to be away from home. And that is where her misery comes from. And how has she tried to deal with that? Well, she makes reference to her alcoholism. Bishop was somebody who struggled her whole adult life with alcoholism. And the reference there, the knowing reference to what alcoholics do, which is try to hide how much they're drinking, he hide the pints behind the 2x4, is important. But what's really important, what screams out as the most important part of this opening stanza of this poem, is that image of the sunrise glazing the barnyard mud with red. Now, one of the key things words that you will learn in relation to Bishop is the word epiphany. An epiphany is a moment of insight, a moment of understanding, a moment of clarity. And you'll know it from The Fish if you watched that video, and you'll know it from Filling Station if you watched that video. Now, I just want you to look and see that image again. We have barnyard mud, so filth and dirt and shit and all that stuff. But in the morning, when the sun is at a certain angle, if the sun hits that mud, because being mud, it's moist, the angle of the light hitting the moist surface of the mud dazzles. It turns something mundane, something ugly, something unattractive, something banal into something which is stunning and beautiful for a moment. Now, don't forget that the mud doesn't stay glazed because the angle of the sun changes and it's just mud again. But for a moment, there's this flash of light, this flash of beauty. For a moment, the ugly reality of the world is transformed. And that's enough to allow him to keep going, to endure, to feel he almost might endure. Those qualifications. Right? This is how hard life is for him. Now, this is Bishop referring to how her life is struggle, but every once in a while, for a short period that doesn't last, something good happens. There are moments of epiphany. There are moments of insight. There are moments of happiness. And that's enough to keep her going. So there, in 14 lines of poetry, you've got your biblical allusion, you've got your appeal to the senses, you've got your vivid and visceral depiction of a scene, and you've got deep, metaphorical, figurative meaning, which gives us insights into the autobiographical truth of the poet's life. Unreal. That's part one of The Prodigal by Elizabeth Bishop.